Welcome to Cognizations, a podcast where we interview cognitive scientists about their work and how it applies to our everyday lives. Cognitive science is the interdisciplinary study of the mind, which brings together cognitive psychology, the neurosciences, linguistics, philosophy, modeling, and more. Without further ado, let's jump into today's episode. With today's hosts, I'm Jay.
And I'm Danad.
What is normal? What is a disorder? Often, when we interact with people who behave in ways we cannot understand, the question of defining quote-unquote normal and sane behaviour becomes apparent. Importantly, when we ourselves exhibit thoughts and behaviours which are viewed as deviant from the commonly accepted definition of normality, we might feel helpless, judged, and inadequate. Historically, behaviours that are diagnostic of mental disorders were viewed as irrational or disruptive. However, recent breakthroughs in cognitive science can shed new light on redefining psychiatric phenomena while erasing the stigma of irrationality. What are these breakthroughs? What goes into elucidating the nature and causes of the many psychological troubles with which one can be faced? Are delusions and other kinds of thoughts really irrational? Today's guest is the person to answer all these questions, or at least some of them.
He is Sam Wilkinson, a senior lecturer in philosophy at the Department of Sociology, Philosophy and Anthropology at the University of Exeter in the United Kingdom. He received his PhD at Edinburgh University and did a postdoc at Durham University on the phenomenon of hearing voices. Currently, he is visiting the Institut Jean-Nicot. His work lies at the intersection of the philosophy of cognitive science and the philosophy of psychiatry. He has published papers on the topics of predictive processing approaches to studying cognition, psychosis, hallucinations, trauma, and much more. Thanks for being on the episode with us.
Thank
today.
you so much. Thanks for having me.
So, just to get us started, for our listeners, could you describe your academic journey till now and how you got interested into cognitive science?
Great. Well, so as a teenager, I was initially really into literature, as so many teenagers are. And it occurred to me that the literature that I particularly enjoyed was literature that had a little bit of sort of profundity to it, right? That would sort of tell you these deep things about life. And so it became quite natural to sort of shift across from literature towards philosophy and kind of towards what your average person on the street thinks that philosophy is. And so I was reading Camus and Sartre and all of these sort of deep but very literary philosophers. And then I decided to merge those two together, and I decided to do philosophy and French at university, which I did at Oxford. And two things happened there. One was that quite apart from arriving and getting a thorough education in French philosophy, which is what I expected by doing philosophy in French, it was two very separate things. So the French offering was sort of far more linguistic, and there was also a core first-year module on medieval French literature, which was not what I was expecting. And on the other side, on the philosophy side, it was lots of like logic, basically. There was lots of logic in first year. And so I thought, wait a minute, not only are these two elements not talking to each other as much as I thought they would, independently, they look different from what I thought they would look like. Right, so the French offering was different to what I expected, and the philosophy offering was very different to what I expected. So that was one thing that happened. But the other thing that happened was because I was at St. Catherine's College, at that time, the philosophy tutor in St. Catherine's College was a man called Tim Bay, who worked in philosophy of mind. And because of the college system, you sort of go and you can pick basically whatever modules you want, and what dictates what lectures you go to is dictated by what modules you choose. So you can choose modules that your college tutor isn't a specialist in. But then what that means is, yes, you'll go to all of the central lectures, but then when it comes to doing the tutorials, one-on-one, one-on-two tutorials, these small tutorials, you get shipped off to other colleges for these tutorials so that you get an offering from somebody who is a specialist. And so it seems to me both strategically sensible to specialize in philosophy of mind so that Tim could do my tutorials, right? And I wouldn't have to walk so far. But also, I just really got into philosophy of mind through that proximity. But in a nearby possible world, right, I could have been excited by something else. And so, yeah, that's how I got into it. That's how I got into philosophy of mind. And then, kind of through Tim's influence, I got into empirically sensitive philosophy of mind, right? So I started to think, well, if we want to answer questions about the mind, maybe we should do some psychology, maybe we should do some neuroscience. And so that was when I got into psychology and neuroscience, and I actually came here to do the Cogmaster. Funnily enough, on Tim Bain's recommendation, because Tim had been a postdoc here, and also it allowed me to use my French as well. And anyway, so that was all great. But then I started doing cognitive science, and then I realized, wait a minute, they don't have all the answers I had, right? So then I went back to philosophy. So in a way, it was a pendulum from kind of philosophy of mind to cognitive science, and then to philosophy of cognitive science. And the area of cognitive science where I felt I got the most purchase, funnily enough, was in neuropsychology, right? So it seemed like whenever you're looking at sort of healthy cognition, the brain or whatever it is you're doing, reaction times, EEG, whatever it is, it doesn't come with an interpretation manual, right? So you always have to overlay your own interpretative resources. Whereas, and I found that slightly frustrating as somebody who's quite explanatorily demanding. And whereas neuropsychology seemed to at least show you things that you couldn't question, right? So if it seemed to me like you get purchase on a machine if you know how it breaks, right? And so I found that suddenly I was getting these little aha moments when, completely independently of any interpretative resources, you go, right, this person has brain damage and this kind of brain damage, and therefore they have optic ataxia, right? Of course, then you got the box and arrow diagrams, and all of that is hugely questionable, but but that initial observation that, wow, okay, if you damage people's brains in relatively well understood ways, you get relatively well understood outcomes. That felt exciting to me, and so that's how I went from cognitive science into broken brains, I guess.
And so you started off, as many people do, I guess, reading Camus and like thinking about these deep questions, these existential questions. Do you think you lost track of that somewhere down the line, or did you separate it from your work, or did you simply just grow out of it?
Well, I definitely didn't grow out of it, but I also think that I did lose track of it for decades, actually. And I'm starting to come back to it. It's almost like I needed to curb my enthusiasm for all of that stuff in order to mature intellectually. And now what's happening is that all of that stuff that used to matter to me has always mattered to me. And I'm kind of coming back to it through the lens of philosophy of psychiatry, but also through the lens of thinking about broader questions about psychiatry and justice and all those sorts of things. And a lot of that is influenced by my institutional surroundings now at Exeter, right? Because I'm surrounded by anthropologists and sociologists, and when they interact with philosophers, I mean, they often refer to people as philosophers who I don't think of as philosophers. So they'll talk to me about Michel Foucault, and I'm like, oh, he's a sort of social theorist or critical theorist or something. And they're like, no, he's the philosopher. I'm like, oh, right. Okay. So, all of these kind of deep questions about the individual's place in society and the oppressive power structures that they are subject to, that's stuff that I'm kind of starting to think about again. But yeah, I definitely lost sight of all of that exciting stuff. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing, because I think that there's a heady cocktail of that stuff mattering, and it really does matter. But how it matters to you when you're an adolescent can derail you, right, from a certain rigor. So it's almost like, retrospectively, I mean, it wasn't strategic or deliberate, right? But retrospectively, I like the fact that I got into logic and that I got a firm grounding in like the driest analytic philosophy of mind and epistemology, and the kind of stuff that, would bore some people to tears. But I'm glad I have that firm grounding, and that I was allowed, that I sort of went through that process and have now returned to quote unquote the stuff that matters.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's a really great question.
So, as a philosopher of cognitive science and of psychiatry, you've been active in an emerging influential approach within the cognitive sciences called predictive processing, and have been applying it to questions pertaining to mental health, as you mentioned. So before diving into the topic of predictive processing, could you maybe tell us what the traditional view of how cognition functions is, and what predictive processing is, and how it differs from this traditional view, and also how it originated, and what motivates it, essentially?
Yeah. So the traditional view is so broad that it encompasses a huge wealth of positions that conflict with one another, and so on. So what predictive processing stands in opposition to is a vast family of views, so vast and so inchoate that even to call them a family of views is inaccurate. But so I think a good way to start is with something totally intuitive, right? If I hit the light switch, right, the lights go on, and the light becomes the room becomes lighter, and you see that it's light. If I turn it off, it goes dark, and you see that the room becomes dark. So that very intuitive observation, right, that we all witness and is just a profound part of the fabric of our lives, engenders an assumption that's perfectly understandable and that all of the standard views share, which is that fundamentally what perception is about and what experience is about responding to things that happen in the world. So if something happens in the world, I respond to it. If I respond to it in some way accurately or appropriately, accurately in the case of perception and appropriately in the case of emotion, right, then I will successfully be able to navigate my world, right? So far, so good, right? But what that then does is that makes it feel like, and that drives an assumption behind all of these different, very, very different frameworks, that the stuff that we care about, the mind stuff, right, whether that be conscious experience, conscious perceptual experience, conscious emotional experience, whatever, right, is somehow a function of what happens in the world, and not just that, but post-dates it temporally, however quickly, right, there's this idea. Let's stick with vision for the case for simplicity. Right? All of these different views think that your perceptual experience at T1 is built out of some sensory event, some impact on your retina from T-1, however small that temporal increment is. Okay. Predictive processing says, hold on a minute, that's not quite right. Okay. In fact, your perceptual experience at T1, right, is determined by something in the upper parts of your brain at T-1, right? And the meeting of mind and brain, the meeting of organism and brain, I should say, right? Bang, the impact of your sensory surfaces upon the world, right, is anticipatory. So when an organism's sensory surfaces encounter the world is already greeted by anticipation, right? And so that very intuitive example of us switching on the lights, switching off the lights, things happening in the world and us reacting to them, the story that predictive processing tells, right, it's not as an implausible enough story to say that none of that matters, right, but that the reaction is indirect. So what happens is that everything happens, all cognition, I was going to say all consciousness, but all cognition, right, consciousness too, right, happens in context. So for any time slice, there's always the thing that comes before. So before you hit that switch, right, there was already all of this expectation. And when the switch gets turned off, it's not that you then construct your experience of a dark room out of the darkness in the world. It's that your predictive hypothesis goes, my predictive hypothesis is no longer accurate, right? And the contribution of the world is to correct your predictions, right? But in a sense, you're always ahead of actuality. So the way that I think about this is in terms of two things: ambiguity and efficiency, right? So ambiguity is what the brain has to do. It has to make sense of an incredibly ambiguous world, but it has to do so efficiently as well. And the ambiguity speaks to the kind of Bayesian strategy, and the efficiency speaks to the predictive processing, the prediction error minimization implementation of that Bayesian strategy.
Can should I in the Bayesian?
Yes, great. I was hoping you would say it. Yes. So if you think about, so when I say that the world is ambiguous, what does that mean? And I don't just mean what does that mean causally, I mean what does that mean conceptually? Well, it means that for any given bit of evidence, for any given bit of input, there is more than one hypothesis that would be adequate given that input. All I need is for it to be more than one. It could be two, it could be three, it could be an indeterminate amount of it could be an indeterminately large hypothesis space.
So in the case of the light switch,
right,
you would have presumably maybe the light is a different shade than you'd expect, or it doesn't turn on, or
exactly, or for example, I could have different hypotheses about what caused the light. Did it turn on or off? But yes, exactly. So I'll give a concrete example, which is a stock example that I like to use. So imagine you are you're in your bedroom. I'm thinking in the sort of British context where you might be sort of in your bedroom upstairs, and downstairs is the sort of living space, the kitchen. So you've just gone upstairs to your bedroom. It's nighttime. You're home alone. and you hear a downstairs window squeak, and you think, now suppose that for ease, suppose that two hypotheses present themselves. One is, that's a burglar climbing in through my window, and I should be really scared. The other one is, that's just the window. Sorry, that's just the wind blowing the window. Okay. Now, both of those have adequate fit, which is to say that if they were to be true, they would generate that sound. Okay. So why would you skew one things in favor of one hypothesis or the other? You need something to tip the balance. And that is what is called, in Bayesian terms, prior probability. But it's a very simple idea. It's just that how probable is a particular hypothesis as a background probability, independently of the evidence, hence prior probability. Right. So before I hear the squeak, completely independently of the squeak is irrelevant, right? What is the probability of, given the circumstances, the wind blowing my window or a burglar climbing in through my window, right? And if I know that the meteorological conditions are such that it's a windy night and I live in a really low crime rate area, right, then that gives a high prior probability to the wind hypothesis. Alternatively, right, if I know that it's a very, very quiet night and I live in a high crime rate area, then that might give the burglar hypothesis a high prior probability.
But I think just to build on this and ensuring that we sort of follow those stories so far, you would, at least in the predictive processing framework, perception is sort of ahead of the sensory picture that is being presented by the world. And I think this is a very unintuitive idea at first when people sort of think about their first person experience. They're like, but we are seeing the world at a high fidelity rate. So maybe could you just talk about some concrete examples, as you said in vision, that would sort of drive this point home that actually our perception is sort of anticipatory and is sort of ahead of the picture that the world is presenting us.
Right, yeah. So a good example of this is, there are all sorts of effects, right? So that demonstrate this, the contribution that our brains make to what we're being presented, right? So one example of this is the hollow mask illusion, right? So if you take a mask and it is spinning round and you see the hollow mask, the hollow back of the mask, your brain corrects that to see that as a normal face. Right. Now, what's going on there is that the hypothesis hollow face is the one that has the best fit. I mean, it's literally what you're being presented with, right? But your brain goes, no, that I don't see hollow faces. On the other hand, there's a neighboring hypothesis that has got very nice high prior probability, which is a normal sticky outy face. And so I'm going to correct that. So that's one dimension. I mean, that's not particularly, the temporal dynamics of that aren't quite brought out. So here's perhaps a better example. There's this phenomenon of sine wave speech, right? So where you'll have like a garbled speech sound, and you'll listen to it and it'll just sound like this inchoate, garbled, fuzzy sound. And then if somebody tells you what it says, you listen to it again and you hear it clear as a bell. So that's another example. Another example is the McGurk effect. So if you've got somebody saying bar, 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 and you keep playing the sound of bar, 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 but then you change the visuals to make it look like the person is saying var, right? You will hear var as long as you're looking at the lips. Now what's happening there again is this Bayesian predictive processing story where the hypothesis with the best fit, because it's what you're literally hearing, is bar, but your brain goes, hold on a minute, I know that human beings can't produce the sound bar when they are doing var with their lips, and so you hear it as bar. So that's another. But there are all sorts of other effects to do with anticipation. So
I'm sure the listeners can check these out as you've named these effects. But I think an important question here becomes, is the source of the priors that inform these hypotheses? Because
excellent.
You sort of talked with respect to the McGurk effect, for instance, that our brain sort of knows that there's high prior probability that lips moving wah is like a strong evidence for the auditory signal wah. But where are these priors coming from? Are they coming from experience? Are they coming from evolution?
A bit of both is the answer. So, I mean, this is a huge question, and I think it needs to be engaged in a lot more, where the priors come from. So, take the hollow mask illusion, for example. Is it just a statistical effect? Is it just that I'm so statistically familiar with sticky outy faces relative to hollow faces? Or does the hollow mask illusion get massively bolstered by the innate importance of face as a stimulus? Now, I think that what happens is that there's a risk of, and this is actually part of the nativism debate, completely independently of predictive processing. We need to be careful about talking about innate priors.
So what's the nativism debate?
Oh, yes. Well, so the nativism debate is the nature versus nurture debate, right? So how much of our, and in the cognitive sciences, of course, that's to do with cognition. So how much of our cognition is innate, how much of it is learnt? And of course, that plays out concretely in terms of how invariant certain things are, right, across cultures, upbringings, etc. So something that is innate is something that you will find cross-culturally across Homo sapiens. But we need to be careful, because when we say things like, oh, are these priors innate? We need to distinguish between these priors are learnt, these priors have a propensity to be learnt more easily than they otherwise would on purely statistical grounds, versus a third thing that kind of doesn't really make sense, right? The priors are just there when you're born. Right? Or arguably that is a difficult thing to make sense of. We can maybe later, when we start talking about the further developments within predictive processing, we can talk about how you can sort of make sense of that notion.
Right.
But through notions of literally embodied predictive processing notions. But yeah, I mean, so one place where this plays out, and I think it's very interesting, because I think in the micro history of the development of predictive processing, which we may end up talking about later, but part of the air that we breathed in Edinburgh, academically speaking, because in Edinburgh you're in the PPLS, philosophy's in the PPLS, philosophy, psychology, and language sciences. So around around 2008, 2009, all the way through to the early to mid 10s, you had a very active language evolution and cognition group within our building, within the same building as us when we were doing philosophy. So, and what was interesting about that, and what relates this to the nativism debate, is that they were very technologically savvy, they were very into their machine learning, and they were anti-Chomskyan. virulently anti-Chomsky, right? But they weren't they weren't into predictive processing yet. But what they would say is they would say things. I would go to these sorts of interdisciplinary talks where I would see people like Professor Simon Kirby, for example, saying things like, well, you know, Chomsky's got it all wrong. It's not that, you know, if you think about, for example, the poverty of the stimulus, right, that kids learn language way faster than you would expect them to. How does that work? Well, language must be innate. Well, you're just not thinking in a sufficiently Bayesian way. You're not thinking in a Bayesian enough way. And also, you're not thinking in a sufficiently environmentally embedded way, right? So instead of thinking, what is the human brain such that it is smart enough to learn language, you need to think about that as a two-way thing, right? What properties must language have in order to make itself learnable by the brain? So anyway, that's just by way of saying that was sort of because you asked, where do the priors come from? Are they innate or are they learned? And that just made me think of this perhaps underappreciated academic context in editing, that there was an anti-Chomskyan vein that was kind of complexifying, problematizing the very notion of language being innate. No, at most, what you're going to have is you're going to have all of these priors that are particularly amenable to being laid down.
So yeah, so you said just a bit before that that we could go into the further developments, and in fact what you've been doing up until now is talking about doing bare bones and vanilla, as we could call it, predictive processing. So what are these further developments and variants on here?
It's going to mint chopped chip and whatever. Cooking down with the Ben and Jerry's. Yeah, good riddance. Great. Well, so the vanilla predictive processing is just about the basic combination of the Bayesian strategy, which of course you can be a Bayesian and not think that the mind is anticipatory, as you rightly pointed out, and but so it's the combination of the Bayesian strategy and the prediction error minimization implementation of that strategy. So the way in which you get beyond that is to reflect on a number of things. One is that, okay, the brain is trying to settle on these hypotheses based on how well they predict what's going on, but organisms in general, and especially human beings in particular, they move in different contexts. And different contexts, it's not just that the world is noisy, it's just that it's that in different contexts, the world is differing in its amount of noisiness, in its amount of ambiguity. So what you need for predictive success, for a real embodied organism that finds itself in different contexts, and very simply, right, twilight as opposed to midday, right? That's a different informational context, but also different levels of threat, etc., right? Different levels of arousal, different levels of fatigue. Anyway, so to achieve predictive success, you don't just need to have good predictions, but you need to have a good estimation of how much you should trust your predictions. So that's one of the first steps towards complexifying the picture, which is usually thought of. There would be two ways of doing that, right? One would be that you would just add predictions about predictions as part of your architecture. But there's a much simpler way, which is what people tend to go for, and it's also something that doesn't incur an infinite regress, right? Because of course, if you've got predictions of predictions, then you need predictions of the predictions of the predictions. But So what tends to be done is that estimation of the variability, the extent to which you should trust your predictions is modulated by precision, right? So you just have your bog standard, straightforward predictions, and then depending on the quality of the informational context that you're in, in a high informational context, when lighting is good, in the case of vision, it'll have high precision, right? If lighting is bad, you would lower the precision, right? Also, you've got different levels of precision for different modalities. So remember with the McGurk effect, how what I see in the lips of the speaker overrides what I hear. That's because there is more precision in vision than there is in audition.
So is precision just another way of saying how much you weigh the evidence that is coming in from the world to the mind?
Well, so this is very interesting, and this speaks to the instrumentalism of the framework. Ultimately, it doesn't. So when I say the instrumentalism of the framework, what I mean is that it's a way of thinking about neurons. Is this what's really going on in the brain? Well, no, right? There were just neurons doing their thing in the brain, right? So to answer your question, if you have more precision, it means that you open yourself up to more prediction error. Now, is that because when you increase the precision on the hypothesis, you're being more demanding of the world, right? Logically speaking, right? Then you're more likely to be wrong, and therefore you're going to get more prediction. If I say, "Hey, I bet that car that I can hear coming around the corner is blue," right? That opens me up to less error than if I say, "Hey, I bet it's dark blue," or "I bet it's this particular shade of blue." The more precise you are, logically, you're going to incur more error. But another way of thinking about it, which is actually computationally equivalent, right, is that you can think of precision as just turning up the gain on prediction error, right? So the hypothesis stays the same, but what you do is whatever error is generated is just felt more strongly. So the way most people think of precision is in terms of turning up the gain on prediction error, right? Which is a slightly odd way of talking, because you might think that precision is something that attaches to the hypothesis, not to the evidence. But people use them interchangeably because they basically say, ultimately, all I want to know is, as a result of this modulatory mechanism, which is thought to be modulated by dopamine, but we can talk about that later. Ultimately, you just end up with more prediction error. And so what basically happens is, what this additional modulatory mechanism does is it means that you now have two areas of potential accuracy and inaccuracy, two areas of success and failure, right? My predictions can just be wrong or right, but alternatively, independently of whether my predictions are wrong or right, I might have a second order success or failure, where the extent to which I should be trusting my predictions is inaccurate, right? And so I might take myself to be in a higher informational context than I actually am, right? And as a result, trust prediction error, like put too much weight on prediction error. You kind of get that in contexts where you're walking down a half-lit alleyway and you freaked yourself out a little bit, and so you, for a split second, see some kind of ambiguous shape in the corner, and you see it as like a lurking threat.
Like
Yeah, exactly. You're about to get mugged, and then, oh no, that's just a bin. Okay.
Yeah.
But yeah, so there are two levels of potential inaccuracy, that first and second. So that's one way of going beyond the vanilla. In a way, that's the first step.
But wait a sec. So, just be clear, so there's these two ways of thinking about the modularity, thing for precision. One of them is to view it as like part of the hypothesis, seems more intuitive.
Yes.
And the other one is just the turning up the gain on prediction error. The predictions that these two versions make, not the predictions that we attribute to the mind, but the theoretical scientific predictions, are they basically the same for these two ways of viewing precision, or are they different in some ways?
So I think there should be a way of teasing them apart, but that has not, as far as I know, they have been seen to be empirically equivalent, in that whichever one of those two you go for, in any given context, you'll end up with more prediction error. Does that make sense?
Yeah, because it seems like you would want to capture the example you gave with the predicting on the one hand that the car will be blue, and on the other hand it'll be a certain shade of blue. And it seems like just turning up the gain on prediction error doesn't really capture that difference at all.
It doesn't. But I think that, again, this speaks to the way in which this is just an overlay onto the neurological reality. Because I think what they would say is, they say, well, actually, as a theoretical entity, prediction error is just a quantity that is a function of the relationship between the hypothesis and the evidence.
So to tease apart these two things, you'd have to add some more stuff, further stuff to this theory.
Exactly. Exactly. And you may also end up committing yourself to a level of realism that is unjustified as well.
Okay. Yeah, as compared, as opposed to instrumentalism.
Exactly.
Exactly. Yeah.
Exactly.
So yeah, sorry, go.
And then just moving on to some of the other developments that you were we were discussing about. You also mentioned that you feel the prediction error in some way all the way up to the hypothesis space. So is this where another development is sort of going towards in terms of emotions?
Yes. Okay, good. Yes. I think that before we get to emotions, we need to talk about action. Because I think there are two successive waves of thinking about emotions in predictive processing terms, and one of them does not make use of action, and the other one does. So let me say a little bit about action. So one way of thinking about the predictive processing framework is in terms of this dictum, right? So you might think that what it actually is, it's not really a framework. It's a full-blown theory, right? That says all the brain ever does is minimize prediction error. Right? The brain's overarching imperative is to minimize prediction error. And that sort of makes sense when you're talking about perception. But then how does action fit in, right? How do motor commands fit in, right? And here is where a really clever move happens. So there's a really nice paper by Adams, Shipp, and Friston called Predictions, Not Commands, right? And they make this point, which is basically a point that, you find it in Aquinas, you find it in Anscombe, you find it in all of these classic texts, that there's a difference in direction of fit, right? So one way of making my hypotheses fit the world, right, is to make my hypotheses respond to the world. And that's what you might call perceptual inference. And that is what you get in vanilla PP, vanilla predictive processing. But there's also another way of making your hypotheses fit the world. And that is to change the world to fit your hypothesis. Right. Again, John Searle has these the mind to world direction of fit, the world to mind. It's basically the same idea, right? And so what becomes the functional equivalent of a motor command is a bodily prediction. So say I want to raise my arm. I generate a bodily prediction about my arm going up and then fulfill that prediction. Now, of course, my predictions about what is going to happen are going to fail if it's for things that I don't have control over, right? But you get nice stories about how, for example, skilled artifact use becomes incorporated in predictive processing, like the blind person using their cane, right? Their attention, the bounds, their sensory boundaries become the tip of the cane onto the floor rather than their finger onto the cane, right? Because of that skilled active inference. So so you've got perceptual inference where my hypotheses are updated based on what's happening in the world, and there's active inference where the world updated to my hypotheses. But interestingly, the scope of active inference is not necessarily constrained. It's just constrained by control. It's not necessarily bodily, right? Which is interesting. So that's one other dimension. And you mentioned emotion. So here's where emotion comes in. And here's why it was important to do that first. Because the question is emotion on the perceptual inference side of things, or is it on the active inference side of things? So the first wave of thinking about emotion, there's a lovely paper by Anil Seth from going way back to maybe 2013 or something, where the basic idea is as follows. Just as perceptual experience is the hypothesis, is a function of the hypothesis that my nervous system generates in order to make sense and then subsequently predict exteroceptive signals from the outside world hitting my sensory surfaces. Emotional experience is exactly the same thing, but for visceral change, right? For bodily change. So what an emotional experience then becomes is perception of bodily change, right? Which of course is William James. It's a Jamesian story. Now, it's not that that's wrong, it's that it's somewhat limited, right? It's limited for two reasons, right? The perceptual hypotheses that I generate are evaluatively neutral. Right? They don't have positive or negative valence, at least built into them.
And what do you mean by valence? Wait.
Positive. So like, they're neither felt nor good or bad, as good or bad, right? My visual experience of that coffee cup on the table, right, could be that I'm really thirsty and I really want coffee, but that's a downstream thing, right? The hypothesis itself is neutral, is informational, right? It's neither positive nor negative. It's neither pain nor pleasure. It's neither good nor bad. Emotions are very different. Emotions have valence packed into them. So one problem with that initial story about emotion is that it lacks valence. And of course, the clue is in the name, right? Emotion, right? Emotion moves as well. Those two things are kind of related. So more recent developments that are perhaps too technical for me to talk about now, but I could try if you want, try to develop a predictive processing account of emotion in a way that incorporates those two elements, right? The positivity and negativity of certain emotions, affective valence, right? And also explain why it is that emotions move us, and sort of incorporate a kind of... So the initial question, is emotion on the side of perceptual inference or active inference? Both.
So now that you've sort of given us a broad overview of what predictive processing is and what the different developments have been, let's turn to one of its most exciting applications, understanding and treating mental health issues.
Yes.
So much of your work examines various ways of explaining so-called pathological phenomenon with the help of predictive processing. So before delving into this further, it's important to just remark for our listeners that this is part of a broader enterprise of asking philosophical questions about psychiatry. What is the nature and origin of seemingly irrational cognition? How can we better study the causes and accommodation of mental disorders and so on? So the question then is, why does psychiatry need philosophy and sociology? I mean, people might wonder that we might not need to ask these philosophical questions when there are already so many different professionals like the psychiatrists and clinical therapists who are already working on this. So would you have some comments on that?
Yeah. So I think the contributions of philosophy, and at this point I should probably plug my textbook. So I published a textbook at the start of this year, the Routledge Contemporary Introduction to Philosophy of Psychiatry. And it was a difficult thing. It was a very difficult thing to write. It took 4 years, and it was a difficult thing to come back from. So for a really long time, while I was working on it, and immediately afterwards, people would be like, "Hey, what are you working on?" And I'd be like, the entire breadth of philosophy of psychiatry, from what is effectively critical sociological approaches all the way to like philosophy of neuroscience and everything in between. So this is all by way of saying the potential philosophical contributions to psychiatry are vast and varied. And so one thing that somebody with a better way of framing the issue is, what does philosophical training bring to mental health research and mental health practice? Mm. So philosophical training brings, at one level, clarity of thought, right? Because there is a hell of a lot of loose thinking in all kinds of research, right? But psychiatric research in particular. So kind of this sort of conceptual clarity. I mean, this reminds me of a little funny thing. When I was working in the voice hearing project, Hearing the Voice in Durham, I was one of the philosophers in this big interdisciplinary team, and people referred to me as the conceptual hygienist because I'd drop in and I'd say, "Oh no, well you've used this word, but you're equivocating, or you've not been sufficiently clear about what you mean, or you've taken this to have consequences that it doesn't actually have, because here are some other hypotheses that you haven't considered," and so on and so forth. So there's this role of like conceptual hygienist. I'm going to own that. There's the role of conceptual hygienist. So that's one role, right? The conceptual clarity that philosophy brings, but also the fact that as a philosopher, you aren't a technological specialist. You're not a specialist in any particular institutionally sanctioned technology. And so what that opens up is this interesting freedom to see the big picture. Now, the big picture allows for two things. It allows for integrative approaches, right? So quite aside from being a conceptual hygienist, you can then also be the glue that binds together different things, right? So take voice hearing, for example. We'll have people doing symptom capture fMRI studies. You'll have people doing EEG studies. You'll have people doing behavioural studies, lexical priming studies, eye tracking studies, right? Psychiatric epidemiological studies. I could go on, right? And then somebody has to come in and tie it all together, because you're all talking about the same chunk of reality, right? At the risk of sounding grandiose for us philosophers, right? It's philosophers who can do that, right? Because they are conversant, or they can become conversant in all of these things.
in a sense, it isn't grandiose because it's a question of the time that you have.
Yes, exactly. I don't even need to hang up my lab coat. Yeah, that's how much time I have.
Dust off your armchair sometimes.
Exactly, just dust off the armchair sometimes. So there's that. So it allows that integrative. So the freedom and the division of labor, the big picture thinking allows you to integrate different disciplines. And this is something that I've got into more recently, partly because of my proximity to anthropology and sociology, but also to do with what you asked, Jay, about me returning to my slightly adolescent predilections. It gives you a critical perspective. So it makes you go, right, I'm standing back from all of these institutional things, and wow, some of these institutional structures are systematically biasing, right, or toxic, or harmful, or unjust. So think about, for example, how the drive for evidence-based medicine gave rise to randomized control trials, and how randomized control trials were held as the gold standard, and how to get a really good randomized control trial, you need a placebo condition, right? There you're already biasing in favor of pharmacological interventions because, goodness me, it is so much easier to develop a controlled placebo condition with a pill than it is for some other kind of therapy. Then that also introduces all sorts of vested interests on the part of big pharma. Then you end up lowering thresholds for certain disease inclusion criteria, and so on and so forth. Right. So that's another thing that philosophy can do.
Especially for psychiatry. I mean,
especially for psychiatry.
Philosophy, you do require philosophy in every aspect of life, but it just, given from the implications that you seem to speak of, it does seem that it has these very real-world consequences for people who might be diagnosed with having a particular disorder.
Exactly. But what's interesting is that as a philosopher, you can see that you don't have to see that as a deliberate evil move, right? It's sometimes just like dumb institutional lock-in, right? You know, the initial focus on evidence-based medicine was, you know, the initial motivations were noble, and then you have a cascading effect that leads to things that are problematic. But yeah, so I think philosophy does all of those things. Conceptual clarity at the micro level, tying together different disciplines, casting a critical lens. Also just here's something that's subtly different from the critical lens, right? Re-examining the taken for granted. So that which is taken for granted, just re-examining it, thinking, okay. But yeah, so yeah, philosophy I think can contribute a lot.
So in the introduction, you talked about how you got from philosophy to empirically informed philosophy of mind, and then from empirically informed philosophy of mind to cognitive science and to cognitive neuroscience. That is using data from, you know, brain lesions, pathologies to study the brain. But philosophy of psychiatry is something different from that still. So how did you get from the cognitive neuroscience and philosophy of cognitive science side of things to philosophy of psychiatry?
That is a really great question. And the story is more causal than justificatory. So basically I got really into brain injury and different manifestations of brain injury. And one that is particularly interesting, and I mean, there's a disciplinary boundary that is interesting between neuropsychology and neuropsychiatry. Right. So neuropsychology is when you've got brain injury, and as a result, you've got interesting deficits that you can talk about, whether that is visual agnosia. So visual agnosia is an inability to sort of recognize and categorize objects that you see, or, optic ataxia, where when you get a dissociation between the two, right? So one where you can't guide your action based on what you're seeing. So that's neuropsychology. Neuropsychiatry is when you've got brain injury and it generates quote unquote psychiatric phenomena. So somebody will have localized brain injury and then will suddenly have delusions, which are a hallmark of quote unquote madness, psychosis. So a good example of this is the Capgras delusion. So I'm going to use a very concrete example, right? A 20-something-year-old man has a motorcycle accident, wakes up from a coma, his parents visit him, and he says, "Those aren't my parents." And this is very perplexing for the clinicians because they've done neuropsychological assessments and he's otherwise fine, right? So he goes back home, but what's weird is that he also, when he gets discharged, he goes back home to live with them, and he just keeps insisting, look, that guy, he's a very nice guy, and he looks just like my dad, but he's not my dad, right? So I started looking at those after looking at neuropsychology generally, and then that got me into thinking about, that's what I meant when I said it's causal rather than justificatory. It just so happened that I was looking at delusions in the context of brain damage, and then I started looking at delusions more generally, because in order to look at delusions, I needed to understand what the concept of delusion was. And of course, delusions in the context of quote unquote functional psychiatry as opposed to organic conditions, right, where a brain scan doesn't show you massive brain damage. The sheer quantity of delusions in that context far outweighs, delusions in the context of brain damage are vanishingly rare compared to delusions in the context of schizophrenia, bipolar disorder. I always feel awkward using all of these categories, but anyway. So that was how I got into psychiatry. Yeah.
Great. So since you were talking about delusions right now, how would you understand delusions from a predictive processing framework?
Right. So that is very interesting because I don't like thinking about delusions in terms of predictive processing. But other people do. So maybe what is more helpful is to tell you about the standard approach that the burgeoning field of what's called computational psychiatry, a subset of which leans heavily on predictive processing. The standard predictive processing accounts of psychosis, would that be helpful? And then we can talk about delusions, and then we can maybe talk about why I don't like applying predictive processing to delusions, although I do like applying predictive processing to hallucinations. Okay. So does that make sense?
Our original plan was to go through these things, hallucinations, delusions, trauma, and then just ask the question.
Yes.
How is it standardly studied? How do you approach it? What can predictive processing do for it? So I guess we can do that. So
great.
If you like, we can start with hallucinations.
Great. Good. Yeah. So basically, remember what we said about precision. Okay. So precision is really important for the application of predictive processing to psychosis. So there were all of these observations, basically you had empirical methods, experimental psychology, effectively, that was being used on clinical populations, people with diagnoses of schizophrenia, and it was hoped that would help us understand schizophrenia. It might provide diagnostic biomarkers for schizophrenia, etc., etc. And so what you had is it was a very important book, very slim book, by Chris Frith, entitled The Neuropsychology of Schizophrenia, from 1992. And in it, he presents what you might call a self-monitoring theory of schizophrenia. So he thought, well, you've got all of these different symptoms of schizophrenia, but basically the positive symptoms, the psychotic symptoms, the things that disconnect somebody from reality are to do with this phenomenon of self-monitoring, right? So when we do stuff in the world, right, our nervous systems basically keep track of when what's going on in the world is produced by us and when it's produced by the world. When this goes wrong, right, you will end up doing something and thinking that it's coming from the outside world. So one of the symptoms of schizophrenia is delusions of control. So you'll get up in the morning, you'll brush your hair, and you'll go, I didn't brush my hair, somebody else brushed my hair. Somebody is controlling my actions. That's kind of ground level understanding of self-monitoring. But then that gets applied if you think about your inner life, right? Inner speech, certain imaginative episodes, certain recollective episodes, right? There's this kind of self-monitoring that we take for granted, right? We take for granted our nervous system's capacity to differentiate stuff that happens that we have done and stuff that happens that the world has done. And that is gives us a fundamental grip on reality. Now, it doesn't take a huge imaginative leap to imagine what it would be like if you lost the differentiation between what I do and what the world does. So you'll have an episode of inner speech and then you'll think, actually, that didn't come from me, right? It'll feel loud, it'll feel aggressive, it'll feel uncanny, right? It's a wonderfully evocative idea, this idea of self-monitoring. However, what's not clear is, even if you say, right, there are these self-monitoring deficits, there's no story about why it is that people with schizophrenia have these self-monitoring deficits. There are just cool studies like people with schizophrenia can tickle themselves, but you can't, right? You can't tickle yourself because your nervous system is already anticipating the sensory consequences of your actions through this process of self-monitoring. So there are all these cool observational studies. Now, in parallel with all of that, you've got biological psychiatry making huge advances in understanding, ion gating and ion, I-O-N, not I-R-O-N. But basically how synapses work, right? And neurobiological advancements. So you've got first generation antipsychotics and second generation antipsychotics and all that. So completely independently of these experimental and largely behavioral experiment data to do with clinical populations, in parallel with that, you've got neurobiological advancements in understanding antipsychotics, right? So antipsychotics basically block dopamine receptors and reduce psychotic symptoms. And how do you link those two together? And that's where predictive processing comes in, right? Because if you think that what dopamine fundamentally does is modulate precision, turn up the gain on prediction error, right? Then what you might then think is that psychosis involves too much dopamine, right? Therefore, too much prediction error. Therefore, computationally, what the psychotic individual, the nature of the error of the psychotic individual, right, is that they take themselves to be in a much higher informational quality environment than they are actually in. So they generate lots of prediction error. The precision is too high. And if the central dictum of predictive processing is correct, that the brain strives to minimize prediction error, in an attempt to quell all of that prediction error, the psychotic brain, for want of a better term, generates all of these erroneous hypotheses. Right. Now, I like the way that now the traditional way of talking about that. So there's a really nice paper by Paul Fletcher and Chris Frith. So interestingly, Chris Frith, who was a proponent of the self-monitoring theory, very quickly moved across to predictive processing, broadly predictive processing approaches. And in that paper, it's called Perceiving is Believing. Well, he starts it and then colon something else. They say, well, this predictive processing story about there being too much prediction error, that gives us a nice account of perception, but also because predictive processing is hierarchically arranged, at the top of the hierarchy, right, it gives us a nice story about delusion, about belief. Now, I really like predictive processing for hallucination. In particular, quite aside from the details, I like the way that it recasts the central explanatory question. So when I started working on hallucinations, my first step was to just look at, well, not just hallucinations, but voice hearing specifically. I just looked through all of these different accounts. And there were so many different accounts, from spontaneous activation in auditory cortex, misattributed memories, misattributed inner speech, problems with imagination, and so on. All of these different accounts. And they were all trying to answer the same question, which is the following question. When somebody hears a voice in the absence of a speaker, they are having the sort of experience that a healthy person normally has when there is a particular environmental stimulus, namely a speech sound. How do we bridge that gap? How do we explain how in the absence of a speech sound, this person's nervous system thinks that there is a speech sound? And so what then becomes the explanatory target becomes, how do we explain the illusion of this environmental stimulus? Now you can see where I'm going here, because this is like us returning to the light switch again, right? About this bottom-up way of thinking, where they're just arguing over how do you give the illusion of this environmental stimulus. Bring predictive processing into the picture, suddenly you turn it on its head and you go, actually, that's no longer our central explanatory hypothesis. We don't need to account for the illusion of an environmental stimulus. We need to ask ourselves, why does this person's brain from the top down generate the hypothesis that somebody is speaking to them? Now, what's interesting about this is this also fits in with some other research I did that had nothing to do with predictive processing. But it was a paper that I wrote with a clinical psychologist, Vaughan Bell, entitled The Representation of Agents in Auditory Verbal Hallucinations. Now, what was interesting about this was we looked at lots of instances of voice hearing, and we said, hold on a minute, this phenomenon is a phenomenon that is predominantly an agentive phenomenon that happens to be auditory, rather than an auditory phenomenon that happens to be agentive. So, and also that plays out in the phenomenon of soundless voices and so on and so forth. And also, but it also is implicit in all of these, like screening questionnaires. How many voices do you hear? Right? That doesn't make sense if all we're interested in is an auditory phenomenon. Right? When you say how many voices do you hear, and the person goes, well, I hear the voice of a 12-year-old boy, a 350-year-old dragon, and those are bound into agents, right? And so again, that fits nicely with the predictive processing idea. The idea that the explanatory target is from the top down, not from the bottom up. So yeah, I found it a really fruitful marriage of predictive processing and hallucinations research.
Yeah, it seems quite intuitive, compelling. So how about delusions now? Why doesn't this apply to delusions?
yes. The short answer is that I think that the predictive processing hierarchy and predictive processing in general is a good story about your experience in all its richness, what it is that you're phenomenologically undergoing now at the moment. Right? Whereas I think that belief is a different thing. And I think that belief is...
Wait, for the listeners, can you quickly say what the relationship between belief and delusions are? Why is it belief?
Yes. Well, so traditionally people have thought of a delusion as a bad belief, right? That's bad in a particular way. So typically you will say, hey, this person is delusional when they make a claim, right, that is obviously false, right? And what's more, they wouldn't count as delusional if they were just open to immediate correction, right? If you went, hey, that's false, and they went, oh yeah, sorry, you're right, silly me, and they updated, then they wouldn't be delusional, right? So there's a double badness of delusion, right? Where it's a belief that is obviously false, right? And it is resistant to counter evidence. There are other conditions that are questionable. Like, for example, people say that delusions aren't supported by evidence. That gets questioned by accounts of delusions that say, well, no, these are just strange beliefs that are based on very strange experiences. Right, so that's one way of thinking about it. But yeah, so delusions are just very bad beliefs. Beliefs that are bad across many different dimensions. Bad in the sense that beliefs ought to be true, beliefs ought to be flexible and evidence responsive. So delusions fly in the face of various oughts, right, that's supposed to govern beliefs. It's not that I think that predictive processing is completely irrelevant to making sense of many, many cases of delusions. It's just that I don't think that... I think that beliefs are an abstract and socially distributed thing, rather than something that sits at the top of the brain.
So would the idea be very broadly that predictive processing approaches to delusion would view these bad beliefs as something the top of the brain, and it's just missing the mark completely because it's, there's something else going on that it just misses?
Yes, exactly.
There's something subtle.
That's exactly it. That's exactly what I think. So this, although this Fletcher and Frith paper is unbelievably important, I do think that something is missed by saying, well, you've got these sort of lower in the hierarchy, you've got all of these kind of sensory hypotheses, and they generate hallucinations. Higher up the hierarchy, you've got more cognitive hypotheses, and these generate delusions. What I think is that if you understand, put beliefs to one side, right? We are social creatures, and we say certain things to each other. We make certain assertions. There's a certain social epistemic ecology that is suffused with this incredible array of incentive and disincentive. Now, what makes something a delusion, right, is that somebody is a profoundly unhelpful component in that network. You can think of the delusional individual as the supremely socially epistemically uncooperative individual. All of that is missed by this sort of excessively neurocentric approach, I guess.
But do you think that is such a thing as a belief-like state, higher order state that does produce, these important errors? But it's just not sufficient to talk about these? Or do you think that these things just it doesn't even make sense to say that these belief-like things exist and do produce error?
So I definitely think that we can talk about there being a gradation between the more sensory side of things and the more cognitive side of things within the brain. I think a helpful way of thinking about that is in terms of temporal scales. So the sensory stuff is resolved at very rapid timescales, and the more cognitive stuff is resolved at slower timescales, and that tends to correlate with levels of abstraction versus concreteness and so on. Now how that then maps onto our folk psychological concept of belief, I think is a different question. I think that what you could say is you can talk about a particular organism's overall informational state, and so how they take things to stand in the world. But I don't think that is happily expressed in terms of like sincere assertion, which is the traditional way of thinking of belief, right? Beliefs are whatever is expressed by a sincere assertion. Right? I think it's an organism's informational state is much more holistic than that. But yeah, I think a lot of the problem with the philosophy of belief is that people are playing fast and loose between these two notions. So they think, well, a belief is something like the endorsement of a particular kind of sentence, or a belief is just like that I take the world to be thus and so, as evidenced by my goal-directed action. Right.
So maybe to sort of switch gears and be more concrete, and sort of bring the circle back to predictive processing, does thinking about these alternative explanations in terms of predictive processing have some downstream implications in refining current practices in therapy or mental health?
Yeah. So one of the things, when we move beyond vanilla predictive processing, one of the things that I didn't talk about was this thing, this move that, so there's this thing called the free energy principle. So the free energy principle is basically the idea that anything that has thinghood has to be obeying the free energy principle. So anything that retains its integrity over time is minimizing quote unquote free energy. So there's a trivial sense in which a rock is obeying the free energy principle. It's retaining its thinghood, right? But it's just retaining its integrity against the world in a very passive way, right? It's just strong enough to deal with what's going on. Then you've got like single-celled organisms, right, that have to be a little bit more proactive, right? And they are minimizing free energy in an active way through homeostasis and allostasis, basically updating their bodily conditions in response to what's going on around them. Right? Now, of course, a single-celled organism, a neuron is just one cell, right? So a single-celled organism ain't got no neurons, right? So, but it is reacting to its world in an intelligent way, but not at the rapid timescales that neuronal machinery allows. Predictive processing. So here's the connection, right? And this is a link made by Carl Friston, of course, who is an absolute towering figure of predictive processing and active inference and free energy. So the observation is that, wait a minute, predictive processing is just how organisms that have neurons obey the free energy principle. It's how they retain their thinghood, how they retain their organismic integrity, how they effectively don't disintegrate and die. Okay? Now, what that does is that it reframes predictive processing in a way that I and many other people have found attractive. Because what it then does is it says, unlike in vanilla predictive processing where you talk about the organism, the nervous system using models of its environment, the organism is a model of its environment. It becomes a model of its environment. So the fact that your hand looks the way that it does, right, is basically, mathematically speaking, predictive processing, but over eons of evolution. Whereas the way in which you respond to your visual environment, right, is that, but a much quicker timescale. Now, why does that matter for thinking about psychopathology? Well, it means that, and this is something I'm in the process of developing at the moment, you move away from the idea that the central imperative of predictive processing is prediction error minimization, right? Because ultimately, there's this little dialectic, right? So in response to that, people said, well, there's this thing called the dark room problem. Why don't you just sit in a dark room? That's a pretty good way of minimizing prediction error, right? And the answer has been, no, well, it's not that you minimize prediction error tout court, it's that you minimize prediction error over time, over the life course. And you go, but the trouble is that no organism knows how long they're going to live, right? No, that's an intractable quantity, right? The prediction error minimized over time, right? So you have this proxy that I call basic control, right? So what every organism strives for is this proxy, which is control. And the computational equivalent of distress and pleasure is achieving control or losing control in this sense. Now, the reason that is important for thinking about pathology, right, is that then you can start to think about pathologies in terms of losing this control and re-establishing control. So, for example, I'm just starting to explore the ways in which, if you think about how music works and how music is pleasurable by giving you just the right amount of unexpected, right? Music is pleasurable when you're basically being statistically flattered, right? When they're saying, hey, here's this thing that's challenging, but well done, you've resolved it, right? If you think about how pleasure in music works and how psychological trauma is distressing, right? You've got nice analogies going on there. So, yeah. I mean, I think the implications are potentially huge.
So before we wrap up fully, would you like to come back to anything you said or that we missed that you think is very important for clarity's sake, let's say?
So this embodied move, this move from the organism making use of using models of its environment to being a model of its environment, that's a move from that. There's a further move that I think is particularly important and that interestingly ties in with my completely unrelated or seemingly unrelated, more kind of sociological approaches to mental illness. And that's this notion of enculturation. So if our brains and our nervous systems and our bodies, right, are just plugging into the statistical structure of our environment, a hugely important part of that environment is cultural and institutional. So I think that's very important, and it makes us think about the human organism as deeply embedded in a particular thought space that's actually quite culturally variable. But I think this makes another general point, because this is something some of my friends who are anti-reductionist, and I'm anti-reductionist to some extent, and who think that there's too much neurocentrism, they criticize predictive processing and they say, brain schmain, who cares about the brain? Let's look at the world, right? Now, this is the beautiful irony of the whole predictive processing thing, that what's basically happened is we've looked at the brain, and we've dug into the brain, and we've looked at it, and our best account of the brain turns around and looks at us and says, don't look at me, look out there. That's the beautiful irony thing, because that's what the brain is fundamentally doing. All it is doing is plugging into the deep statistical structure of the world. And so then you're like, oh, wow, you're right. I should be doing sociology. I should be doing anthropology. I should be, because all the brain is doing is just plugging into that stuff. Right.
And then really understanding how the statistics of the environment is skewed in certain ways, which could have implications on the mind. No, indeed, that's a really beautiful tone on its head from predictive processing. Well, this has been Cognitions, a cognitive science podcast. We've been chatting with Sam Wilkinson. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for having me. That was great. Great fun.
On the next episode of Cognitions, we'll chat with Nancy Canvashow about how one can investigate the modularity of the mind using neuroscience. If you have ever wondered about the architecture of the mind, this episode is not to be missed.